Nobody attended Mrs. Mary's birthday party, but months later, all her children were truly shocked when they read the will and didn't hear what they expected. The mirror on the dresser reflected the wrinkled but dignified face of Mary as she prepared for her birthday. Hello, welcome, enjoy, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Her hands, marked by time, trembled slightly as she placed the last hairpin in her silver hair. The room, imbued with memories, was surrounded by family photographs that silently narrated a life of love and sacrifices. Mary paused for a moment, her eyes scanning the images of her 3 children. Charles, the successful lawyer, Gabriella, the ever-busy socialite, and Martin, the ambitious entrepreneur. A mix of pride and worry crossed her face as she remembered how she had raised them alone after her husband's early departure. With a sigh, Mary rose and walked towards the kitchen. The aroma of freshly baked cake, her children's favorite, filled the air. On the dining room table, 3 carefully wrapped gifts awaited her grandchildren. The elderly woman passed her fingers over the shiny paper, imagining the smiles of the little ones. The sound of the telephone bell broke the silence. Mary's heart skipped a beat with excitement. Could it be Charles, she thought, or perhaps Gabriella calling from Paris? She almost tripped in her haste to answer. "Hello," she replied, her voice full of anticipation. "Mrs. Mary, I'm calling to confirm your medical appointment for next week," said an unknown voice on the other line. Mary's smile slowly faded. "Yes, thank you," she replied with a subdued voice before hanging up and returning to her favorite chair, her gaze fixed on the wall clock. The hands seemed to move with agonizing slowness as the minutes passed. A shadow of doubt began to cloud her hopeful gaze. Had her children forgotten her birthday? No, she said to herself. Surely they would arrive at any moment with a surprise. It had to be so. The wall clock struck 7 p.m. with a sound that echoed in the empty room. Mary, seated in her favorite chair, did not take her eyes off the front door. The meticulously prepared table for a celebration that never came seemed to mock her loneliness. The cake, still intact, began to lose its freshness, just like Mary's hopes. Her wrinkled hands held a card she had written herself, "Happy birthday, Mom." The irony of that gesture hit her hard, and a solitary tear rolled down her cheek. The silence of the house was only interrupted by the occasional beep of her phone. Messages from acquaintances and neighbors, but nothing from her children. Mary rose with difficulty and approached the window. Street lights were turning on one by one. Families returned to their homes, and distant laughter came from the park. The outside world seemed to mock her loneliness. She returned to her seat and took the photo album she had prepared to share memories. She opened it, flipping through pages filled with happy moments. Charles graduating from university, Gabriella on her first runway, Martin closing his first big deal. Where were those children who used to run to embrace her? The phone rang again. Mary lunged for it, her heart beating with renewed hope. "Charles, Gabriella, Martin?" she asked with a trembling voice. "Good evening, ma'am. We're calling to offer you an incredible deal on cable services," replied a monotonous voice. Mary hung up without responding. The weight of reality fell on her like a slab. Her children, for whom she had sacrificed everything, had forgotten her on the most important day of the year. The tears she had held back for hours finally flowed freely. Mary sobbed quietly, her frail body shaking with each ragged breath. The night advanced, and with it, the painful certainty that she would spend her birthday completely alone. The sepulchral silence enveloping Mary's house was faintly interrupted by a timid knock at the door. Mary's heart skipped a beat. A mix of hope and fear took hold of her as she slowly headed towards the entrance. Upon opening the door, Mary came face to face with Laura, her niece. The young woman held a small box of cupcakes and wore a warm smile that contrasted with the sadness in her aunt's eyes. "Happy birthday, Aunt Mary," said Laura softly as she entered the house. The contrast between Laura's unexpected arrival and the absence of her own children struck Mary hard. A mix of gratitude and pain reflected on her wrinkled face as they shared a coffee in the kitchen. Laura listened patiently as her aunt, with a broken voice, told her about the day's disappointment, about how she had waited for hours for her children's arrival. "I don't understand, Laura," whispered Mary, her hands trembling as she held the coffee cup. How could they forget? Laura took her aunt's hand, offering silent consolation. The conversation revealed the young woman's kindness and inadvertently, the disdain Mary's children felt toward her for her humble origins. "Your cousins, they don't understand the value of family, Aunt," said Laura sadly. "They are so busy with their lives that they have forgotten the most important thing." Mary slowly felt a new perspective forming in her mind as she watched Laura, remembering how her children had looked down on her in the past for not having the social status they believed they deserved. As the night advanced, Mary found herself sharing anecdotes from her youth, laughing for the first time that day. Laura's presence had brought a ray of light to what had been a gloomy day. When Laura finally said goodbye, Mary stood at the door watching her leave, a new determination shining in her eyes. That day had been a revelation, and as she closed the door, Mary knew things couldn't continue this way. It was time for a change, and she would make sure it happened. As Mary sank into her favorite chair, memories assaulted her like an unrelenting storm. Images from the past paraded before her eyes, blending sweetness and bitterness in equal parts. She saw Charles, her eldest, receiving his law degree, remembered how she had worked extra hours for years to pay for that expensive university. The pride on Charles's face that day contrasted painfully with his current absence. Then there was Gabriella, always radiant and ambitious. Mary relived countless sleepless nights sewing dresses for her daughter's fashion shows. Now Gabriella was a recognized socialite, but at what cost? Calls had become increasingly scarce, replaced by cold bank transfers. And Martin, the youngest, whose determination had always amazed her. Oh, how she had mortgaged the house to give him the startup capital for his business. Martin's success came quickly, but with it, a distance that seemed to grow with each zero added to his bank account. Mary's sacrifices seemed endless, birthdays spent in solitude, vacations canceled, personal dreams abandoned, all for the well-being of her children. The family inheritance, the fruit of generations of hard work, had become the support for her children's luxurious lifestyles. Mary rose with difficulty and approached the shelf where she kept the family albums. With trembling hands, she opened one of them. The photographs told a story of transformation. The innocent, smiling faces of her children in childhood gradually giving way to harder, more calculating expressions. One photo in particular captured her attention. It was from the last Christmas they had spent together, already 5 years ago. Charles was glancing at his watch impatiently, Gabriella was absorbed in her phone, and Martin seemed more interested in the gifts than in the family company. It was at that moment that Mary felt something inside her break, and at the same time harden. Eyes once clouded by sadness now shone with fierce determination. "This has to change," she murmured to herself, closing the album with a sharp snap. "And I will make sure it does." The dimness of the living room enveloped Mary and Laura like a cloak of complicity. Determination shone in the elderly woman's eyes as she detailed her bold plan to her niece. Laura, though visibly doubtful, listened attentively, her loyalty to her aunt overcoming any reservations. "I'm going to fake my death," declared Mary, her voice surprisingly firm. "It's the only way to make them see the truth." Laura held her breath, processing the magnitude of what her aunt was proposing. "But Aunt, don't you think that's too extreme?" Mary shook her head, her resolution unbreakable. They've forgotten the value of family, the meaning of unconditional love. They need a lesson they can't ignore. Together, aunt and niece plunged into drafting a new will. Mary dictated while Laura took notes meticulously. Each task designed for her children was laden with meaning, each trial carefully thought out to teach a vital lesson. "Charles will work as a janitor in a nursing home," murmured Mary, a sad smile on her lips. "Maybe then he'll learn the humility he's forgotten." "Gabriella will live on a minimum wage for a month," she continued. "It's time for her to see the world beyond her luxury bubble." "And Martin," Mary paused, her voice cracking slightly, "Martin will care for children in an orphanage. He needs to remember the value of selfless affection." As the night advanced, the plan took shape. Laura watched her aunt with a mix of admiration and concern. "Are you sure about this, Aunt? Once we start, there's no turning back." Mary nodded, her gaze fixed on the future she was forging. It's necessary, my dear. Sometimes love requires drastic measures. With the first light of dawn, Mary signed the new will, her hand steady for the first time that day. Laura called the family lawyer, a man who had known Mary for decades and who, after hearing the plan, agreed to be complicit with a mix of reluctance and understanding. As the sun rose over the city, Mary and Laura shared a look loaded with emotions. The plan was underway, and with it, the hope of healing a fractured family. The news of Mary's death spread like wildfire in a dry forest. The impact felt across 3 different continents, shaking the seemingly perfect lives of her children. In New York, Charles received the call during an important meeting at his luxurious law firm. His normally impassive face visibly paled. With trembling hands, he excused himself and left the room, ignoring the curious glances of his colleagues. "Are you sure, Laura?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The guilt gnawed at him inside, remembering the call he never made on his mother's birthday. Meanwhile, in an exclusive spa in Paris, Gabriella was immersed in a bath of salts when her assistant broke the news. For a moment, her mask of indifference cracked, revealing genuine pain. She abruptly exited the bathtub, splashing water everywhere, her mind a whirlwind of memories and regrets. "Cancel my appointments for the week," she ordered, her voice breaking slightly. "I have to go home." On the other side of the world, in Tokyo, Martin was closing the deal of his lifetime when he received the message. The champagne he was about to uncork remained forgotten as he processed the news. His usually ambitious face darkened with a mix of shock and regret. "I'm sorry, we'll have to postpone the celebration," he murmured to his partners, leaving them perplexed. Despite the initial shock, none of the 3 made immediate plans to return, each caught in their own web of commitments and obligations, beginning to look for excuses to delay their return. Meanwhile, in their hometown, Laura faced the arduous task of coordinating the fake funeral. With a heavy heart, she received condolences from neighbors and friends, feeling increasingly guilty about the deception. In the solitude of her hotel room, Mary watched everything through Laura's updates. Each message, each reaction from her children was like a stab in her heart, but she remained steadfast, convinced that this pain was necessary for greater healing. The tension reached its peak when the children began to inquire about the will, revealing their true priorities. Their questions, more focused on the inheritance than on honoring their mother's memory, only confirmed to Mary that her drastic plan was sadly necessary. The fake funeral of Mary became an elaborate theater of genuine emotions and necessary deceptions. Laura, with the weight of the secret on her shoulders, moved among the mourners like a consummate actress, her face a perfect mask of contained pain. Mary's house, once silent and forgotten, now buzzed with activity. Neighbors and old friends arrived in waves, their faces marked by genuine sadness that painfully contrasted with the absence of the supposed deceased's children. Mary was the heart of this neighborhood, the sun itself. Mrs. Martinez, a neighbor for life, always had a kind word for everyone. Laura nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. Each compliment, each shared anecdote was a reminder of the love Mary had sown in her community and of the painful indifference of her own children. The most tense moment arrived when Dr. Ramirez, Mary's family doctor for decades, came to offer his condolences. Laura felt the ground open beneath her feet. "I'm so sorry, Laura," said the doctor, his eyes full of genuine compassion. "Your aunt was an extraordinary woman. I still can't believe she's gone so suddenly." Laura stammered a response, her mind racing to maintain the farce. "Thank you, doctor. It was very sudden for all of us." Meanwhile, in a room on the upper floor, Mary watched everything through a small hidden camera. Each tear shed by her neighbors was like a balm for her wounded heart, but it also intensified her determination to carry out her plan to the end. As the day progressed, Laura found herself drowning in a sea of guilt and doubts. Was all this pain really worth it? Would they really achieve the change that Mary hoped for in her children? As night fell, when the last of the visitors had gone, Laura went up to the room where Mary was hiding. She found the elderly woman sitting by the window, her face streaked with silent tears. "Aunt," whispered Laura, "are you sure you want to continue with this?" Mary turned to her niece, her eyes shining with a mix of pain and resolution. More than ever, my dear. Today I've seen more love and respect from strangers than from my own children in years. It's time for them to learn the true value of family. At that moment, Laura's phone vibrated. It was a message from the lawyer. The envelope with the testament instructions had been sent to the firm. The game had officially begun. The day of the reading of the will dawned gray and oppressive, as if the weather itself foreboded the emotional storm that was about to be unleashed. The lawyer's office, normally a place of sober formality, vibrated with barely contained tension. Charles, Gabriella, and Martin, gathered for the first time in years, sat in uncomfortable silence, avoiding eye contact among themselves. Their faces, marked by jet lag and poorly disguised guilt, betrayed a mix of pain and anticipation. Laura, sitting in a corner as executor of the will, watched her cousins with a mix of pity and disapproval. The lawyer, a reluctant accomplice in Mary's plan, entered the room with a sealed envelope in his hands, his expression unreadable. "Before we proceed," began the lawyer, "I must express that the content of this will is unusual." The siblings exchanged confused glances. Charles, always the first to take control, cleared his throat. "What do you mean by unusual?" The lawyer, without responding directly, began to read. As the conditions of the will were revealed, the atmosphere in the room transformed dramatically. "Work as a janitor!" exclaimed Charles, his face reddening with indignation. "This has to be a joke." Gabriella, hearing her own task, let out a hysterical laugh that soon turned into crying. "A month with minimum wage? But my monthly expenses are 10 times that." Martin, apparently the most composed, paled visibly at the mention of the orphanage. "There must be a mistake," he murmured, more to himself than to the others. The reading continued, detailing how the fulfillment of these tasks was a condition sine qua non to receive their part of the inheritance. The silence that followed was deafening. Suddenly, as if a dam had broken, the siblings erupted into a cacophony of protests and accusations. "Contest this will," shouted Charles, banging the table with his fist. "It's clearly the product of a disturbed mind." Gabriella, between sobs, pleaded with the lawyer. "Please, there must be another way. I can't live like this. I just can't." Martin, regaining his businessman's composure, tried to negotiate. "Surely we can come to a more reasonable agreement." Laura, observing all this, felt a mix of sadness and vindication. Her aunt's plan was working. The true natures of her cousins were being laid bare. The lawyer, unflappable, closed the envelope. "The conditions are clear and irrevocable. You have 1 month to decide whether you accept them or renounce your inheritance." As the siblings continued to argue, Laura couldn't help but think of Mary, alone in her hideout, and how she would react to knowing that her last act of maternal love had unleashed such chaos. The morning after the reading of the will, the city woke up with an unusual energy. The 3 siblings, still shocked by the conditions imposed by their mother, faced their first tasks with a mix of incredulity and resentment. Carlos, impeccably dressed in his designer suit, showed up at the Sunset Golden Nursing Home. The smell of disinfectant and old age hit him like a slap. A nurse with pronounced dark circles and a tired smile handed him a janitor's uniform and a bucket with cleaning supplies. "The second-floor bathroom is clogged," she informed him dryly. "Start there." With trembling hands and a grimace of disgust, Carlos faced his first trial. Every movement of the mop was a blow to his pride. Every stain on the mirror a reminder of how far he had fallen. Meanwhile, Gabriella found herself in a neighborhood supermarket, a shopping list in one hand and a handful of crumpled bills in the other. Her eyes, usually perfectly made up, were bare and disoriented as she navigated the aisles. "What do you mean you don't accept credit cards?" she exclaimed, frustrated at the checkout. The line behind her grew, and the irritated glances from other customers made her feel small and vulnerable. Martin, for his part, arrived at the New Hope orphanage intending to complete his task as quickly as possible. However, nothing had prepared him for the avalanche of children who surrounded him as soon as he crossed the door. "Will you read us a story?" asked a little girl, her large brown eyes full of hope. Martin, accustomed to negotiating with tough businessmen, found himself completely disarmed by that innocent gaze. As the day progressed, each sibling faced their own demons. Carlos, cleaning the corridors, listened to the life stories of the elderly, stories of love, loss, and resilience that began to crack his facade of indifference. Gabriella, struggling to make the money stretch, found herself talking to a single mother who taught her tricks to save. For the first time in years, she felt a genuine connection with someone outside her social circle. Martin, surrounded by children hungry for attention, discovered a part of himself he thought he had lost. The laughter of the little ones, so pure and sincere, began to melt the ice he had built around his heart. As night fell, the three siblings returned to their respective lodgings, physically and emotionally exhausted. None would admit it, but something had changed in them. A small seed of humility and empathy had been planted, waiting for the moment to bloom. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon when the three siblings received the news that would change the course of their trials. A message from the lawyer informed them that, by their mother's express wish, all tasks had to be performed in their hometown, Old Oak. The little town, nestled between mountains and forgotten by time, was a place they had avoided for years. To them, it represented a past they preferred to forget, a constant reminder of their humble origins. Carlos was the first to arrive, his luxurious car clashing with the cobblestone streets. As he got out, he encountered curious glances and barely concealed whispers. "That's Inessa's son. Look how he's changed. So many years without coming." Gabriella arrived shortly after, struggling with her designer luggage. The heel of her shoe got caught between the cobblestones, causing giggles among the children playing in the square. Her normally unflappable face tinted with embarrassment. Martin was the last, having delayed his arrival as much as possible. As he entered the town, he felt as if time had reversed. Every corner, every tree seemed to hold a memory from his childhood. The three met in front of their old family home, now closed and looking abandoned. The contrast between its current state and the warm memories they held of it was painful. "Well, what now?" Gabriella broke the uncomfortable silence. "I guess we should look for accommodation," responded Carlos, his tone revealing how little he liked the idea. The only inn in town, the Sleeping Oak, had only 2 rooms available. After a heated discussion, Carlos and Martin agreed to share one, while Gabriella occupied the other. That night, as each prepared for bed, the reality of their situation hit them hard. They were back in the place they had worked so hard to leave behind, facing tasks that challenged everything they believed they knew about themselves. In the darkness of his room, Gabriella stifled a sob. Carlos, listening to Martin's snores, wondered how he had gotten to this point. And Martin, pretending to sleep, struggled against the memories that threatened to overwhelm him. Meanwhile, hidden in a house on the outskirts of town, Mary received the daily report from Laura. With every detail, her heart wrestled between sadness and hope. "God forgive me," she whispered to herself, "but this is necessary." The town, oblivious to the drama unfolding, was preparing for the coming days. The arrival of Inessa's prodigal children promised to shake up the quiet routine of Old Oak, unearthing long-guarded secrets and testing family ties like never before. The dawn in Old Oak brought with it palpable tension. The three siblings, still bewildered by the turn of events, headed to their respective tasks with a mix of resignation and resentment. Carlos arrived at the Golden Years Asylum, a dilapidated building on the outskirts of town. As he entered, the smell of medicine and old age hit him hard. A tired-looking nurse handed him a faded uniform and guided him to the corridors he was to clean. As he scrubbed the floor, cursing under his breath, a brittle voice startled him. "Carlos, is that you?"
Inés son.
He turned to find Dona Carmela, an elderly woman with lively eyes, looking at him in astonishment. "Your mother and I were like sisters," continued Dona Carmela, her eyes filling with tears. "She would be so proud to see you here, helping the needy." The words pierced Carlos's heart like needles. As he listened to Dona Carmela recount stories about his mother, a young woman full of dreams and determination, he felt something inside him begin to crack. Gabriella, for her part, faced her first day in the town's cafeteria. Her hands, accustomed to luxury manicures, were now red and cracked from hot water and soap. Every order taken wrong, every broken dish, was a blow to her pride. During her break, she found herself talking to Lucia, a single mother who worked 2 shifts to support her children. Lucia's story, full of sacrifices and small joys, made Gabriella question her own priorities for the first time in years. Martin spent the day at the local orphanage, surrounded by children hungry for attention and affection. A little boy with large brown eyes, Pedrito, clung to him from the first moment. "Will you stay with us?" he asked, a mix of hope and fear shaking Martin to the core. As he played with the children, Martin couldn't help but think about his own childhood, the moments of simple joy he had shared with his siblings and mother. When had he lost the ability to enjoy the little things? As night fell, the 3 siblings met at the inn, exhausted and shocked by their experiences. None wanted to admit it, but something had changed in them. The stories they had heard, the lives they had touched, were beginning to slowly melt the layer of indifference they had built over the years. In the intimacy of their rooms, each wrestled with their own demons. Carlos couldn't get Dona Carmela's stories out of his head. Gabriella stared at her battered hands, thinking of Lucia and her children. Martin, lying in the dark, listened to Pedrito's laughter echoing in his ears. None of them knew it, but this was just the beginning of a journey that would change their lives forever. The morning sun found Laura walking through the cobblestone streets of Old Oak, her heart torn between loyalty to her aunt and growing empathy towards her cousins. She watched from the shadows, catching snippets of their daily struggles, a silent witness to their slow transformation. In the cafeteria, Laura saw Gabriella struggling with a stubborn coffee machine. Her eyes, once full of disdain, now showed determination mixed with humility. Laura felt a pang of guilt as she watched her cousin bite her lip, holding back tears of frustration. Later, she passed by the asylum where Carlos was cleaning the corridors. She watched him stop to listen to an old man who told him stories from the war. His face, normally arrogant, was now softened by genuine attention. Laura had to restrain herself from revealing her presence, moved by this glimpse of humanity in her cousin. At dusk, she approached the orphanage. Through the window, she saw Martin surrounded by children, reading to them in a voice she had never heard from him, full of tenderness and patience. The lump in her throat tightened as she saw the sincere smile on her cousin's face, so different from his usual sneer of superiority. As Laura returned to the house where Mary was hiding, she was surprised by Carlos coming out of a store. In a moment of panic, she hid behind a tree, her heart beating hard. "Laura, is that you?" Carlos's voice startled her. She turned slowly, facing her cousin's inquisitive gaze. "Carlos, I was just passing by," she stammered, her mind racing to come up with a credible excuse. "Passing by an old oak?" asked Carlos, his tone mixing suspicion and curiosity. "What are you really doing here, Laura?" At that moment, Laura's phone vibrated. It was a message from Mary asking about the day's news. Laura felt the world closing in around her, caught between the lie and the truth, between her duty and her emotions. "I came to visit Aunt Mary's grave," she lied, hating herself for each word. Carlos stared at her, as if trying to read the truth in her eyes. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I understand. It's good that someone does," he said, his voice breaking slightly. As she watched Carlos walk away, Laura felt the weight of guilt crushing her. Was all this deception really worth it? Were they doing the right thing? That night, in the solitude of her room, Laura cried silently, torn between her love for Mary and the pain she saw in her cousin's eyes. The plan that once seemed just and necessary now felt like an unbearable burden. The blazing midday sun fell on the New Hope orphanage when Martin organized an outing to the nearby park. The excited children clustered around him like a flock of restless birds. Among them was Pedrito, the little boy with brown eyes who had won a special place in Martin's heart. "Are you ready for our adventure, champ?" Martin asked, ruffling the boy's hair. Pedrito nodded enthusiastically, his eyes shining with excitement. The afternoon unfolded with laughter and games, but suddenly, Martin noticed that Pedrito was no longer among the group. A chill ran down his spine as his eyes frantically scanned the park. "Has anyone seen Pedrito?" he shouted, panic growing in his voice. The other children, sensing his fear, began to call for the little boy. The minutes turned into agonizing hours. Martin, forgetting his expensive suit and his image as a businessman, threw himself into the search with a desperation he didn't know he possessed. He ran through narrow streets, crawled through wooded areas, and shouted Pedrito's name until his voice became hoarse. The news spread quickly through the town. Carlos and Gabriela, upon hearing of it, abandoned their tasks and joined the search without hesitation. For the first time in years, the three siblings worked together, united by a common purpose. As the sun began to set, a heart-wrenching scream broke the silence. "I found him!" It was Martin's voice. Pedrito was trapped in a deep ditch, scared but unharmed. Martin, without a second thought, slid down the slippery slope, ignoring the cuts and scrapes he incurred in the process. Carefully, he picked up the boy in his arms and began the difficult ascent. "I've got you, Pedrito. You're safe," he whispered, his voice broken by emotion. When they finally emerged, covered in mud and tears, they were greeted by the applause and hugs of the community. Carlos and Gabriela ran towards them, their faces reflecting relief and pride for their brother. That night, as the three siblings shared a silent dinner at the inn, something had changed. The barriers they had built over the years were beginning to crumble. Martin, looking at his still trembling hands, reflected on the fear he had felt, a fear that had nothing to do with money or status. "You did something extraordinary today," said Carlos, breaking the silence. "Mom would be proud." Gabriela nodded, unshed tears shining in her eyes. "We all are." At that moment, the three felt the weight of years of indifference and selfishness. The experience had shaken them to the core, revealing a truth they had long forgotten: the true value of human connection and unconditional love. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and toasted bread filled the small cafeteria where Gabriela was busy cleaning tables and serving early morning customers. Her hands, once perfectly cared for, now displayed calluses and small cuts, silent witnesses to her new reality. While cleaning a table in the corner, an old photo album forgotten under a chair caught her attention. Intrigued, she picked it up and began to leaf through it. Suddenly, her heart skipped a beat. There, among the yellowed pages, was the smiling face of her mother, Mary, decades younger. Gabriela sat down, completely abandoning her tasks. Photo after photo, she saw a Mary she had never known. A young, vibrant woman surrounded by friends, engaged in community projects, with a light in her eyes that Gabriela couldn't recall ever seeing in her mother. "Ah, I see you found the old gang's album," said a voice nearby. Gabriela looked up to find Don Ramon, a cafeteria customer. "You knew my mother?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Don Ramon sat down opposite her, his eyes sparkling with memories. "Know her? Your mother was the soul of this town, girl. There wasn't a community project Mary wasn't involved in, always thinking of others, always with a smile, even in the toughest times." As Don Ramon shared story after story, Gabriela felt as if she was getting to know her mother for the first time. He told her about how Mary organized a fundraiser to rebuild the school after a fire, about the nights she spent caring for the sick during a flu epidemic, about how she convinced the town council to create a scholarship program for the town's children. "Your mother understood that true success isn't measured in money or fame, but in the lives you touch, in the difference you make," concluded Don Ramon. Gabriela, with tears streaming down her cheeks, looked at her battered hands and then at the photo of her young, vibrant mother. For the first time, she saw the resemblance between them, not just in physical features, but in the capacity to work hard for something bigger than oneself. "What happened to us?" she murmured to herself. "When did we become so empty?" The rest of the day passed like a dream. Every customer, every conversation, every cup of coffee served took on a new meaning. Gabriela began to see the town and its people through her mother's eyes, discovering a richness that money couldn't buy. That night, as she closed the cafeteria, Gabriela made a decision. She pulled out her phone, ignored for days, and canceled all her social appointments and commitments for the next month. For the first time in years, she felt she was exactly where she needed to be. With the photo album under her arm, Gabriela walked through the town streets, each step taking her not just to the inn, but towards a rediscovery of herself and her mother's legacy. Dawn found Carlos in the corridors of the Sunset Golden nursing home, his janitor's uniform wrinkled after a night of insomnia. Dona Carmela's words about his mother still echoed in his mind, mixing with the memories of the search for Pedrito and the transformation he saw in his siblings. While cleaning the floor of the East Wing, a commotion caught his attention. In a room at the end of the corridor, an elderly man was yelling, refusing to take his medication. Carlos approached, more out of curiosity than duty. "I won't take anything until my lawyer is present," the man was shouting. Carlos stopped dead in his tracks. He recognized that voice. He entered the room and found himself face to face with Alberto Guzman, his father's former business partner. The emaciated old man, with disheveled white hair, was barely a shadow of the powerful businessman Carlos remembered.
Carlos, Eduardo son.
Alberto asked, his voice suddenly soft. Wow, how things change. Over the next few hours, as he helped the nurses calm Alberto, Carlos listened to a story that shook the foundations of everything he believed he knew about his family and his fortune. Alberto, between coughing fits and moments of lucidity, revealed the truth about the origins of the family wealth. He spoke of shady business deals, of bribes, of lives ruined in the name of progress and profit. "Your mother," said Alberto, his eyes clouded with remorse. "Inés was the only one with a conscience among us. She tried to stop us, you know. But Eduardo and I were young, ambitious. We didn't listen." Carlos felt as if the world was crumbling around him. Every luxury he had enjoyed, every privilege he had taken for granted was tainted with guilt and the suffering of others. "Why are you here, Don Alberto?" asked Carlos, his voice barely a whisper. The old man let out a bitter laugh. "Karma, boy. I lost everything trying to make amends for our mistakes. Your mother, she was right all along." As Carlos finally left Alberto's room, he felt as if he had aged decades in just a few hours. He looked at himself in the hallway mirror, seeing for the first time not the successful lawyer, but the son who had ignored the most important lessons from his mother. With trembling hands, he took out his phone and dialed his firm in New York. "It's me," he said when his partner answered. "I need you to investigate all our cases from the last 5 years. Any irregularity, anything that doesn't feel right, we're going to fix this, no matter the cost." As he hung up, Carlos felt a mix of terror and relief. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in years, he felt he was doing the right thing. That night, when he met his siblings for dinner, Carlos looked at them with new eyes. He no longer saw competitors or disappointments, but allies in a journey of redemption that was just beginning. The afternoon sun bathed the cobblestone streets of Old Oak when Gabriela entered the cafeteria for her evening shift. The fatigue of the past few days was reflected in her face, but there was a new determination in her eyes, born from the revelations about her mother. As she cleaned the tables, her attention was captured by a conversation in the corner. Two elderly women, with steaming cups of tea in front of them, spoke in low but animated voices. "I tell you, Matilda, it was her. As sure as my name is Consuelo," said one, leaning toward her friend. "But Consuelo, how can it be?" "We all went to the funeral," replied the other, skepticism in her voice. Gabriela approached, pretending to clean the adjacent table, her heart pounding hard. "I saw her with my own eyes on the outskirts of town, near the old Morales house." "It was Inés, I swear," insisted Consuelo. Gabriela dropped the cloth she was holding, startling the elderly women. "Excuse me," she murmured, picking up the cloth with trembling hands. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. She finished her shift in a state of stupefaction, the words of the elderly women ringing in her ears. Could it be true? Was her mother alive? Without a second thought, Gabriela headed to the outskirts of town. The road to the Morales house was almost covered by vegetation, a sign of years of abandonment. As she approached, her heart beat faster and faster. And then she saw it. Through a window partially covered by vines, she caught a glimpse of movement, a familiar figure with silver hair and an upright posture passing in front of the window. Gabriela choked back a scream, her hand covering her mouth. It was impossible. And yet she took a step toward the house but stopped. What if it was true? What did all this mean? Paralyzed between shock and disbelief, Gabriella remained motionless, watching the house. Thousands of questions flooded her mind. Why would her mother fake her death? Who else was involved in this? As the sun set, Gabriella finally walked away from the house, her world completely overturned. She couldn't share this with her siblings, not without being sure. She needed proof. She needed answers. That night, in the solitude of her room at the inn, Gabriella wrestled between hope and fear. If her mother was alive, what did that mean for them? For the lessons they were learning, for her own transformation. With determination, she decided that the next day she would investigate further. She wouldn't rest until she uncovered the truth, no matter how painful or surprising it might be. Dawn found Mary pacing restlessly in the living room of the old Morales house. The news from Laura about Gabriella's near discovery had left her in a state of agitation. Her plan, so carefully crafted, now hung by a thread. "Aunt, we have to reconsider this," insisted Laura, her voice laden with concern. "Things are getting too complicated. Gabriella suspects, and the others are changing, Aunt. They really are changing." Mary stopped in front of the window, her gaze lost in the horizon of the town she once knew. "Maybe you're right, my dear. But what if it's just a facade? What if they return to their old habits as soon as they believe the inheritance is secure?" The sound of a car approaching interrupted their conversation. It was the lawyer, arriving for his weekly report. With him, he brought news that would shake the foundations of Mary's plan even further. "Martin has started the adoption process for Pedrito," informed the lawyer, his tone one of surprise. "And not only that, he's using his contacts to improve the conditions at the orphanage." Mary sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the news. "My Martin, the same one who said that children were a waste of time and money?" The lawyer nodded, continuing with his revelations. "Carlos has requested a complete audit of his firm in New York. He seems to be preparing for some kind of large-scale legal confession or rectification." "And Gabriella?" Mary asked, fearing the answer. "She has canceled all her social engagements for the next month. According to my sources, she's organizing some kind of charity fair with local merchants." Silence fell on the room like a heavy blanket. Mary looked at Laura, seeing in her eyes the same conflict she felt in her heart. Her plan had worked beyond her most optimistic expectations, but at what cost? "Aunt," said Laura gently, "I think it's time to tell them the truth." Mary closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her decision. She had initiated this plan with the intention of teaching her children a lesson, to show them the value of empathy and hard work, but now she was risking losing them forever. "I need time," murmured Mary. "Just a little more time to be sure." As the lawyer said goodbye and Laura prepared for another day of surveillance, Mary was left alone with her thoughts. She looked at the photos of her children, those she had brought with her to her hideout, and for the first time since she began this plan, she allowed herself to cry. The tears that ran down her cheeks were a mix of pride for the changes she saw in her children and deep regret for the pain she was causing them. The line between maternal love and manipulation had never been so thin. Mary found herself teetering dangerously on it. The midday sun fell mercilessly on Old Oak, but the activity in the town did not diminish. In the center of this renewed energy were, unknowingly, the three children of Mary, each immersed in projects that would have seemed unthinkable weeks ago. Carlos, with his shirt sleeves rolled up and his hair disheveled, sat in the main square, surrounded by elderly and young families. He had improvised a sort of free legal clinic, offering advice on issues ranging from property disputes to labor rights. "Don't worry, Dona Mercedes," he said to an elderly woman with tears in her eyes. "We'll make sure you receive the pension you're entitled to. It's your right." A few streets away, in the cafeteria where Gabriella worked, she led a meeting with local merchants. The place buzzed with energy as they discussed plans for a charity fair. "We could use the square for the booths," suggested Gabriella, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. "And all the money raised will go directly to renovating the primary school." Meanwhile, at the orphanage, Martin was on his knees in the yard, helping the children plant a vegetable garden. His hands, once only familiar with the touch of legal documents and computer keyboards, were now covered in dirt. That's right, Pedrito. He encouraged a little boy struggling to dig a hole. The carrot needs space to grow, just like you. As the day advanced, the effects of their actions began to ripple through the town. People talked, shared stories, rediscovered a sense of community that seemed to have been lost over time. In the square, a group of young people approached Carlos, inspired by his initiative. "We want to help," said a girl. "How can we contribute?" In the cafeteria, the merchants, moved by Gabriella's enthusiasm, began to offer more than was asked of them. "I can donate all the flowers for decorating," offered the local florist. "And my brother can take care of the music," added another. At the orphanage, potential adoptive parents, attracted by rumors of the improvements, began to arrive. Martin greeted them, sharing his own experience and encouraging them to consider adoption. As the sun began to set, the three siblings, without knowing it, had initiated a transformation that went beyond themselves. The town, which once saw them as arrogant outsiders, now looked at them with a mix of wonder and gratitude. That night, when they gathered for dinner at the inn, there was a different glow in their eyes, a sense of purpose that none had experienced before. "You know," said Martin, breaking the silence, "I think I finally understand what Mom always tried to teach us." Carlos and Gabriella nodded, their faces reflecting a mixture of nostalgia and newly acquired understanding. "I wish she were here to see it," murmured Gabriella, not yet daring to share her suspicions about her mother. What none of them knew was that Mary, hidden in the shadows outside the inn, had witnessed it all. With tears in her eyes and her heart torn between pride and guilt, she silently walked away, aware that the moment of truth was approaching inevitably. The evening fell on Old Oak, tinting the sky with shades of orange and purple. Laura walked through the cobblestone streets, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She had spent the morning watching her cousins, amazed by what she saw in them. But the weight of the secret she kept was becoming increasingly unbearable. She stopped in front of the cafeteria, watching Gabriella through the window. Her cousin, once a symbol of frivolity and superficiality, now moved among the tables with a grace and kindness that Laura had never seen in her. She was so absorbed in her observation that she didn't notice Carlos approaching from behind. "Laura," her cousin's voice startled her. "What are you doing here?" Laura turned, finding herself face to face with Carlos's inquisitive gaze. Her mind raced, searching for a believable excuse. "I was just passing by," she stammered, repeating the same lie she had used days earlier. Carlos frowned, his lawyer's instinct detecting the falsehood in her words. "Again, just passing by, Laura? What's really going on?" Laura's heart pounded hard. She could feel her aunt's elaborate plan beginning to unravel. Just then, her phone vibrated in her pocket. It was a message from Mary. "I need to see you urgently. Things are getting complicated." Laura looked at the message, then at Carlos, feeling the world closing in around her. The pressure of the past weeks, the pain of seeing her cousins suffer, and the guilt for her role in the deception finally overwhelmed her. "Carlos," she began, her voice breaking, "there's something you need to know." But before she could continue, Gabriella came out of the cafeteria, surprised to see her brother and cousin together. "What's going on here?" asked Gabriella, her tone mixing curiosity and suspicion. Laura looked from Carlos to Gabriella, feeling the weight of their gazes. In that moment, she made a decision that would change the course of everything. "I need you to come with me," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "There's something you need to see." Without waiting for a response, Laura started walking towards the outskirts of town, towards the house where Mary was hiding. Carlos and Gabriella, confused but intrigued, followed her in silence. As they walked, Laura felt a mix of relief and terror. She knew she was betraying her aunt's trust, but she also felt it was the right thing to do. The secrets and lies had lasted too long. As they approached the old Morales house, the sun set on the horizon, as if the day itself was holding its breath in anticipation of the revelation that was about to come. Laura stopped in front of the door, turned to face her cousins, and with a deep breath, said, "There's someone who wants to see you." With a trembling hand, Laura knocked on the door, knowing that on the other side, Mary would be as surprised and terrified as they were by what was about to happen. The silence that followed the knock seemed to stretch for an eternity. Carlos and Gabriella exchanged looks of confusion and anticipation, while Laura held her breath, her heart beating hard against her chest. Finally, the door opened with a creak. There, framed by the threshold, stood Mary, her silver hair shining in the evening light, her eyes full of a mix of love and fear, landing on her children. "Mom," whispered Gabriella, her voice barely audible. Carlos, for his part, took a step back as if he had seen a ghost. The moment of shock was interrupted by the shrill sound of a phone. It was Martin calling Carlos urgently. "Carlos, you have to come to the hospital right now." Martin's voice sounded distressed. "It's Pedrito. He's had a relapse, and they need a family member's consent for an emergency operation." The scene turned into a whirlwind of emotions and actions. Without a second thought, the four, Mary, Carlos, Gabriella, and Laura, rushed to the hospital. The reunion, the explanations, everything took a back seat to the imminent crisis. Upon arriving at the hospital, they found Martin, pale and disheveled, pacing nervously in the waiting room. When he saw his mother, his eyes widened. But before he could say anything, the doctor appeared. "We need a decision now," said the doctor urgently. "The operation is risky, but without it..." Martin, shattered, looked at his family. "I'm not his legal guardian yet. I can't make this decision." It was then that Mary stepped forward. With a voice that left no room for doubt, she declared, "I'm his grandmother. I'll give the consent." The doctor, although visibly confused by the appearance of this woman, whom everyone believed dead, had no time for questions. He accepted Mary's consent and rushed to the operating room. The following hours were an emotional roller coaster. The family, gathered under circumstances no one could have imagined, waited for news about Pedrito. Among whispers, Mary began to explain her plan, the reasons behind her faked death, and how she had observed the transformation of her children. Carlos, Gabriella, and Martin listened in silence, their emotions swinging between disbelief, pain, and, surprisingly, understanding. Laura, sitting a little apart, watched as years of misunderstandings and distance began to unravel. When the doctor finally came out of the operating room, everyone held their breath. "The operation was a success," he announced with a tired smile. "The kid is strong. He'll recover." The relief that flooded the room was palpable. Martin collapsed into a chair, tears of gratitude running down his cheeks. Mary approached him, enveloping him in a hug she had longed to give for weeks. As the family united in a collective embrace, mixing tears of joy for Pedrito and emotion from their reunion, it became clear that this moment marked not just the end of a deception, but the beginning of a new phase for everyone. The truth had come to light in the most unexpected way, and now, united by a crisis and by the love they rediscovered among them, they would face together whatever the future held. The dawn found the Morales family gathered in the small cafeteria of the hospital, coffee cups untouched in front of them. The silence that enveloped them was charged with unspoken questions and truths about to be revealed. Mary, sitting in the center, seemed to have aged years in a single night. Her eyes, tired but determined, scanned the faces of her children. Carlos, with his suit wrinkled and the beginnings of a beard, kept his gaze fixed on the table. Gabriella, devoid of her usual perfect makeup, fidgeted nervously with the edge of her cup. Martin, exhausted after spending the night by Pedrito's bedside, struggled to stay awake. "My children," began Mary, her voice barely a whisper. "I know I owe you an explanation." "An explanation?" interrupted Carlos, his voice tinged with bitterness. "You made us believe you were dead, Mom. Do you have any idea what we've been through?" Mary nodded slowly, accepting the weight of her actions. "I know, and I'm deeply sorry, but I need you to understand why I did it." For the next hour, Mary unraveled the complex web of her plan. She talked about years of worry, watching how money and success were pulling them away not just from her, but from the values that had once been the core of their family. She told them about nights of insomnia, wondering where she had gone wrong as a mother. "On my birthday," her voice broke as she spoke, "when none of you showed up, I knew I had to do something drastic. Gabriella sobbed softly, the memory of her negligence hitting her with renewed force. Martin clenched his fists, fighting against his own emotions. "And this circus with the will?" asked Carlos, his tone still harsh, but with a glimmer of understanding beginning to emerge. "Everything was an elaborate lesson?" Mary nodded. "I wanted you to remember who you really are, beyond the money and status. I wanted you to see the world as I see it, full of people who need help, of opportunities to do good." As Mary continued revealing how she had watched their struggles and transformations, the atmosphere in the cafeteria began to change. The initial anger gave way to a complex mix of emotions: pain, understanding, and even, surprisingly, gratitude. "Mom," said Martin finally, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep and emotion, "what you did was extreme, but I think I understand why you did it." Gabriella nodded, wiping away tears. "These weeks have been hell, but they've changed me, changed us all, haven't they, Carlos?" The last bastion of resistance, Carlos finally softened his expression. "I'm still processing all this. But you're right, Mom. We had lost our way. Maybe we needed this awakening." Mary extended her hands across the table, and one by one, her children took them. Laura, watching from a nearby table, felt a weight lift from her shoulders. "What do we do now?" asked Gabriella, voicing the question that was on everyone's mind. Mary smiled softly. "Now, my dears, we start anew. Together." As the sun rose over the hospital, bathing the cafeteria in golden light, the Morales family found themselves at the threshold of a new chapter. The road to reconciliation and redemption was just beginning, but for the first time in years, they would face it together. The afternoon fell on Old Oak when the Morales family decided to move to the old family house. The place, a silent witness to so many memories, seemed the perfect setting for the confrontation that was about to unfold. Mary sat in her old armchair, her children forming a semicircle in front of her. The tension in the air was palpable, like a string about to snap. Carlos was the first to break the silence. "All my life," he began, his voice trembling with contained emotion, "I've chased success, believing that would make you proud. But now I realize I was just running away from who I really am." His words opened the floodgates. Gabriella, with tears streaming down her cheeks, confessed, "I became someone I don't even recognize. I lived for appearances, Mom. I had everything, yet at the same time, nothing." Martin, his voice breaking, added, "I built empires but forgot to build relationships. Pedrito, that boy taught me more in a few weeks than all my years at the top." Mary listened, her heart torn between the pain of seeing her children suffering and the hope of their awakening. "My children," she said softly, "I never wanted to cause you so much pain. I just wanted you to see what—" "Mom," interrupted Carlos, a flash of his old anger resurging, "that we were failures as human beings?" "No," exclaimed Mary, standing up. "I wanted you to see your potential, the goodness that has always been inside you. Yes, you lost your way, but you never stopped being my wonderful children." The room fell silent for a moment, each processing Mary's words. Gabriella, wiping away tears, asked, "How do we fix this, Mom? How can we be the family we should have been?" Mary approached her children, taking Gabriella's hands in hers. "We start here and now, being honest, forgiving each other." Carlos, still wrestling with his emotions, confessed, "I've been looking into our past, Mom. Dad's businesses, there's so much to fix." Mary nodded, a shadow of sadness crossing her face. "I know, son, and I'm proud of you for wanting to make things right." Martin, who had remained silent, finally spoke. "I want to officially adopt Pedrito. And not just that, I want to use my resources to help more kids like him." The atmosphere in the room began to change, the initial anger and resentment giving way to a sense of shared purpose, of redemption. "It won't be easy," warned Mary. "We'll have to work hard to rebuild our relationship, to correct the mistakes of the past." "We'll do it together," said Gabriella, with determination. As a family. As the night fell on the old house, the Morales family found themselves united in an embrace, tears mixing with nervous laughter. The road ahead would be difficult, full of challenges and awkward moments, but for the first time in years, they would face those challenges united. Mary, in the center of the embrace, closed her eyes. Her plan, born out of desperation and love, had worked in ways she never imagined. Now, it was just a matter of hoping that the newly forged bond was strong enough to withstand the trials that were still to come. The dawn found the Morales family gathered in the kitchen of the old family house, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and toasted bread filling the air, bringing with them memories of simpler times. Mary, with renewed energy, moved between the stove and the table, serving her children as she had done when they were little. Carlos, with pronounced dark circles under his eyes, toyed with his cup of coffee. "I barely slept last night," he confessed. "I kept thinking about all that we have to fix." Gabriella nodded, her hair, normally perfectly coiffed, now pulled back in a messy ponytail. "Me neither. But I also thought about all the opportunities we have ahead of us." Martin, who had spent the night at the hospital with Pedrito, entered the kitchen with news. "The doctor says Pedrito can be discharged in a few days. I'm thinking of staying in Old Oak for a while." Mary set down the coffee pot and sat with her children, her face a mix of fatigue and hope. "My children," she began, "I know you have many questions, many feelings to process. I'm here to listen." What followed was a deep and emotional conversation. Carlos talked about his internal struggle between his career and his conscience, about how the past weeks had opened his eyes to a different way of practicing law. Gabriella, with tears in her eyes, shared how she had rediscovered the joy of genuine connections, how the people of the town had accepted her not for her surname or her money, but for who she really was. Martin, the most transformed of the three, talked about Pedrito and the other children at the orphanage, about how they had filled a void in his life that he hadn't even known existed. Mary listened, her heart swelling with pride and love. "My dear ones," she said finally, "what you've achieved in these weeks is more than I ever dared hope." "But, Mom," interrupted Carlos, "how can we be sure this will last? What if we go back to our lives and forget all this?" Mary took her eldest son's hand. "That's the beauty and the challenge of life, Carlos. Every day is a choice, and now you have the eyes to make that choice consciously." Gabriella, wiping away a tear, added, "I don't want to go back to who I was before. I want to stay here, help with the charity fair, make a real difference. I don't want to leave either, not just for Pedrito but for all the children who need help. I can run my businesses from here, use my resources for something that really matters." As the morning progressed, the conversation turned lighter. They shared anecdotes from the past weeks, laughed about past misunderstandings, and began to weave plans for the future. Mary watched her children with a heart full. The road to reconciliation and forgiveness was just beginning, but the seed of change had taken deep roots. As the sun rose over Old Oak, illuminating the kitchen with golden light, the Morales family found themselves united not just by blood but by a shared purpose and a renewed love. The future, though uncertain, looked brighter than ever. The following days in Old Oak were a whirlwind of activity and emotions for the Morales family. The news that Mary was alive had spread through the town like wildfire, generating a mix of astonishment, confusion, and, surprisingly, joy among the inhabitants. Carlos, determined to use his legal skills for the common good, set up an impromptu office in the town's library. One morning, as he reviewed cases of residents who needed legal help, he found himself face to face with Don Alberto, his father's former business partner. "I've come to confess," said the old man, his voice trembling. "I want to make things right before it's too late." For hours, Carlos listened, horrified, to the details of his father's shady dealings, feeling the weight of a tainted legacy on his shoulders. But instead of sinking into despair, he felt a renewed determination. "We're going to fix this, Don Alberto," said Carlos firmly. "It won't be easy, but it's the right thing to do." Meanwhile, Gabriella plunged into the preparations for the charity fair. The town square buzzed with activity as she coordinated with merchants and volunteers. One afternoon, as she hung posters, she ran into Lucia, the single mother she had met in the cafeteria. "Gabriella, I can't believe all you're doing," said Lucia, moved. "You've changed the lives of so many people here." Gabriella, touched, hugged Lucia. "You've changed mine," she replied, realizing how much she had grown in such a short time. Martin split his time between the hospital, where Pedrito was recovering quickly, and the orphanage. One afternoon, while supervising the installation of new playground equipment, he received a call from one of his former business partners. "Martin, have you lost your mind?" shouted the partner. "You're throwing away years of hard work for a handful of orphans." Martin, watching the children play happily, responded with a calm that surprised even him. "No, my friend. For the first time in my life, I'm seeing things clearly." Mary, for her part, reintegrated herself, renewing old friendships and rebuilding bridges she thought had burned. Every day, she watched with pride as her children grew not just as individuals, but as a family. One night, as the family dined together on the porch of the old house, Mary proposed a toast. "To the mistakes that brought us here, and to the love that will keep us united," she said, clinking glasses. Each member of the Morales family felt that something fundamentally had changed in them. The conflicts of the past hadn't magically disappeared, but now they had the tools and the will to face them together. The sun set over Old Oak, bathing the town in a golden glow. The Morales family, once fractured by ambition and selfishness, now found itself stronger than ever, united by a common purpose and rediscovered love. On the day of the big charity fair, the sky dawned clear and a fresh breeze seemed to herald good omens. The main square of Old Oak buzzed with activity from early morning, colorful booths, cheerful music, and the aroma of homemade food floating in the air. Gabriella, dressed in a simple floral dress, a far cry from her usual designer outfits, ran from one end to the other, making sure everything was in order. Her face radiant, she reflected a happiness she hadn't felt in years. "Gabriella," called Lucia, approaching with a tray of cakes. "The school children have decorated these for the sale. Where should we put them?" Gabriella smiled, moved by the community's effort. "Right here, in the central booth. They'll be the star of the fair." Meanwhile, Carlos was in a corner of the square, where he had set up a free legal advice booth. A line of people waited patiently, each with their own story and need. "Next," called Carlos, adjusting his glasses. An elderly woman approached, her wrinkled hands holding a bundle of papers. "Young man," she began, "they've been trying to take my house away. I don't know what to do." Carlos listened attentively, taking notes, and feeling a satisfaction that no corporate case had ever given him. "Don't worry, ma'am. We'll sort this out together." At the center of the square, Martin supervised a play area for children. Pedrito, now fully recovered and full of energy, ran among the other kids, his laughter infectious. "Dad, look!" shouted Pedrito, waving a drawing he had just made. Martin froze for a moment, overwhelmed by emotion. It was the first time Pedrito had called him that. "It's beautiful, champ," he responded, hugging the boy tightly. Mary watched everything from a nearby bench, her heart overflowing with pride and love. Laura sat beside her, handing her a glass of lemonade. "Aunt," said Laura softly, "did you ever imagine your plan would turn out like this?" Mary shook her head, her eyes brimming with tears. "Never in my wildest dreams, my dear. But this is more than I ever dared to hope." As the day progressed, the fair filled with laughter, music, and the spirit of community that Old Oak had rediscovered. The Morales siblings, once distant and selfish, now worked in harmony, each contributing their unique talents for the benefit of all. As night fell, with the stars shining over the town, the family gathered in the center of the square. Carlos announced that they had raised double the expected amount for the school renovation. Gabriella shared plans for future community initiatives. Martin, with Pedrito in his arms, talked about expanding the support program for the orphanage. Mary, surrounded by her children and the affection of the town that had once seen them grow, felt her heart might burst with happiness. The plan that had been born out of desperation and love had blossomed into something beautiful and transformative. As fireworks lit up the sky, marking the end of the fair and the beginning of a new chapter, the Morales family embraced, united not just by blood but by a shared purpose and rediscovered love. A year had passed since that charity fair that marked the rebirth of the Morales family. The garden of the old family house, once neglected, now bloomed with multicolored roses and the sweet scent of jasmines. The perfect setting to celebrate Mary's birthday, a day that contrasted starkly with her birthday the previous year. The afternoon sun bathed the garden in golden light as family members, friends, and neighbors gathered around a long table set under a canopy of twinkling lights. Laughter, chit-chat, and the gentle melody of a violin playing Mary's favorite songs filled the air. Carlos, dressed in a casual shirt and jeans, a wardrobe choice that would have been unthinkable for him a year ago, stood up, glass in hand. The gathering fell silent. A year ago, he began, his voice full of emotion. We thought we had lost our mother. In reality, we had lost ourselves. Mom, your death gave us life. You taught us the most valuable lesson of all, that true success is measured by the lives we touch, not by the bank accounts we fill. Gabriella, tears in her eyes, continued, I learned that true beauty comes from within. Every smile I see on the faces of the kids at the renovated school, every thank you from the elders at the community center, is worth more than all the jewels I ever owned. Martin, sitting with Pedrito on his lap, added, I discovered that the greatest wealth is love, unconditional love. Pedrito and the other kids at the orphanage have taught me more about life and happiness than years at the corporate top ever could. Mary, sitting at the center of the table, listened with tears of happiness rolling down her cheeks. When it was her turn to speak, her voice trembled with emotion. My dear children, friends, neighbors, she began, a year ago, I made a desperate decision born out of love and fear. Today, I see not only my family reunited but a community reborn. We have learned together that forgiveness, love, and compassion are the true measures of a well-lived life. As the sun set, tinting the sky in shades of pink and gold, the party continued. Carlos shared anecdotes about the pro bono cases that now formed the heart of his legal practice. Gabriella spoke enthusiastically about the new community programs she was developing. Martin, surrounded by kids from the orphanage, laughed with a freedom he had previously not known. Laura, watching the scene with a smile, approached Mary. Aunt, she said gently, did you ever imagine everything would turn out like this? Mary took her niece's hand, her eyes shining with wisdom and gratitude. My dear Laura, life teaches us that sometimes we must lose something to gain everything. This family, this town, we have been reborn from the ashes of our mistakes and fears. And in that rebirth, we have discovered the true essence of what it means to be alive and to love. As the night fell over Old Oak, the Morales family and their friends remained in the garden, united not just by bonds of blood or friendship, but by a deep understanding of the lessons learned and the journey taken. The future, though uncertain, was filled with possibilities, illuminated by rediscovered love and shared purpose. And so, under a starry sky, in a garden full of laughter and love, the story of the Morales family did not come to an end but began a new chapter, one written with the indelible inks of compassion, forgiveness, and the true wealth of the human spirit. Please share your impressions and opinions in the comments section. I would be honored if you left a like, and I invite you to watch the following story, which is truly impressive. Blessings.